The Plaquemine culture was an entire civilization of people who lived in the South Mississippi River Valley, approximately from just south of its junction with the Arkansas River to the Gulf of Mexico. Now first, go to patreon.com/Louisiana Dread and become a subscriber to gain access to exclusive content and a podcast. Now, the culture was named after the town of Plaquemine, after an ancient mound was uncovered nearby in the late 1930s called Medora. If you've been keeping up with this channel, you'll know that the town of Plaquemine is named after the Chitimacha word for persimmon. The Plaquemine culture, though, lasted roughly 300 years, from the years 1300 to 1600, and consisted of two platform mounds separated by a plaza. Now, this culture farmed corn, so much so that certain elements of their pottery and intensive corn agriculture are designated for the Plaquemine people. The Plaquemine culture existed at a timeline overlap during the more well-known Cahokia settlement nearby St. Louis, Missouri, but it would be followed in the footsteps of another culture called the Coles Creek culture. That's a lot of alliteration there. The Plaquemines would expand and repurpose sites that were once occupied by the Coles Creek, and they traded with the Mississippian cultures. Normally, Mississippian cultures were what we think of today as towns or villages, but the Plaquemines were usually barely populated ceremonial civic centers. More alliteration there. The only permanent residents were elites with their families, priests, and their slaves. Other members of the culture lived in smaller villages and farmsteads spread throughout the area. As the farming of corn was adopted, a population boom occurred, and the villages would increase in number and size. Some of the records I found suggest that some of the larger sites had names like Winterville and Emerald, translated of course. Now, these were the centers of chiefdoms who exerted control over other smaller civic sites, which were part of hereditary nobility that you'll find more bountifully in Europe. But unlike Europe, the line was based on the maternal line to the ruling chief. The inherent flaw here is that this is a very volatile system. Sometimes factions in smaller centers attain supremacy and power would shift from one civic center to another. This would result in the partial or total abandonment of the former capital. Eventually, Mississippian cultures to the north of the Plaquemines began expanding their culture further south. Almost simultaneously, the influence from the Pensacola culture had began spreading westward across Barataria Bay and the Atchafalaya Basin. By 1700, the undefined northern border of the Plaquemine culture went from the Arkansas River to modern-day Baton Rouge. Now, eventually, the last enclave of purely Plaquemine culture was the southern Natchez Bluffs area, while the Yazoo Basin and Louisiana areas became a hybrid Plaquemine Mississippian culture. Now comes the part when a man named Hernando de Soto, a Spaniard, enters the story. In 1542, he led an expedition of the Mississippi River that lasted for several years, and accounts of their awful treatment of the natives traveled ahead of them. Eventually, the De Soto expedition reached a tribe on the east bank of the river, and the natives there called it Quigaltum. The meeting of the two parties was very brief and very violent. The natives attacked and chased the Spaniards with their canoes, and the surviving Spaniards retreated and finally made it past Quigaltum, only to encounter another unnamed powerful chiefdom that also attacked them. Now, until all these foreigners left, they just kept getting attacked. Keep in mind, the Spaniards never made it on the shore to leave archaeological evidence of contact, so there's not much info on the identity of these tribal locations, and historians still debate them to this day. What is known, though, is that there's no further recorded European contact with the indigenous people in this area until 140 years later, when the first French explorers arrived. By that time, though, power had shifted to the other cultures due to epidemics of European diseases. On top of that, the intrusion of Europeans had upset the delicate political balance between native groups who had existed in a state of ritual warfare between tribes for generations. Many societies in the region began to collapse, and all in all, the central Mississippi River Valley was the most heavily populated area of indigenous people and was likened to the Valley of Mexico, but was almost vacant in comparison by the mid-1700s. During all of this turmoil, the Plaquemine people had been pushed to the Natchez Bluffs area. They were able to maintain their traditions like hereditary elites, ceremonial mound creation, and ritual sacrifices. Supposedly, this is because their encounter with De Soto was so brief in comparison to the more northerly populations. The people living near the Natchez Bluffs area were the last Plaquemine people. We couldn't bring you this information without your support on Patreon, and we thank all of those who have already contributed and encourage anyone watching this video right now to consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Louisiana Dread. For more Louisiana history, horror, folklore, and culture, be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'm Kyle Crosby, and this is Louisiana Dread Quick History.